Thank you, everybody, for turning out. What a great turnout, a nice morning. Glad we didn't get the storms yesterday that they thought we were going to get, so that's always nice. Many of you know our guest speaker today, Dan Minick. Dan has done a number of our TRED Talk presentations. His background in teaching makes him a great presenter, and his car knowledge is impressive. Dan is an advanced instructor in the Department of Management at Kansas State University's College of Business Administration in Manhattan. He teaches courses in operations management and quality management, helping students develop practical skills in process improvement, efficiency, and organizational performance. Dan earned a Bachelor of Arts from Kansas State University in 1987, and later completed an MBA in International Business from Kansas Wesleyan in 1997. His teaching emphasizes real-world application of business concepts, particularly in areas such as continuous improvement and Lean Six Sigma methodologies used to improve organizational processes and reduce inefficiencies. In addition to classroom instruction, Dan has been involved in mentoring students and advising student organizations, supporting experiential learning opportunities that connect business theory with practical industry applications. Dan is an avid car guy with his true passion being foreign cars, especially MGs. He's a volunteer here at the museum and serves on our museum's collection advisory board. Please join me in welcoming Dan Minick, who will be presenting today's topic, Maxwell, from Crisis to Chrysler.
Thanks, Doug. I'm not sure that whole introduction was really about me. Seems like somebody else. No, I appreciate that. So Maxwell, kind of a little-known brand anymore, but the story of it, what is the story of it? So it starts really kind of Jonathan Dixon Maxwell, the namesake of the company, born in Indiana. He worked at an early age at Apperson Brothers Machine Shop in Kokomo, Indiana. And if you know, Apperson was one of the early horseless carriage car companies, Haynes Apperson, and Maxwell actually helped build and create several of those early vehicles there in Kokomo, Indiana. And so after that, Maxwell moved to Oldsmobile, and he was actually instrumental in some of the early Oldsmobile models, working for Ransom Olds at the Oldsmobile facility there. And let's pivot for just a minute here to David Buick. So David Buick had a little car company, and he approached Ben and Frank Briscoe for some financing. So the Briscoe brothers were successful Detroit sheet metal. They had sheet metal radiators, a huge manufacturing facility there in Detroit. And the Briscoes actually bailed Buick out twice, and Buick never could really repay. And so the Briscoes sold out Buick essentially to Flint Wagon Works. So what does this have to do with Maxwell? Well, Maxwell joins the Briscoe company at their sheet metal shop. And here is, right here, this little ad, Briscoe radiators. They had a pretty good manufacturing facility there. And I read this, and I don't know if it's true. They said they invented the metal garbage can, and I don't know if that's true or internet legend stories, but they were cranking out a lot of sheet metal stuff and radiators, and so Jonathan Maxwell is working for the Briscoe brothers. And so him and Jonathan Maxwell and Ben Briscoe actually kind of plan an automotive venture based on, you know, their manufacturing skills and Maxwell's dabbling in automotive. And so Briscoe have money from selling off of Buick, and so they begin production of the Maxwell car, and the company is Maxwell Briscoe at Tarrytown, New York in 1904. Now, why Tarrytown, New York? They had financing from J.P. Morgan, and there was this facility in Tarrytown that J.P. Morgan owned. There was some manufacturing firm in it that went belly up. And they said, well, here's the plant. If you want us to finance you, here's the plant. And so they begin production at the New York facility in Tarrytown, which is just up Hudson River, north of New York City, really Sleepy Hollow area on the east side of the Hudson. So here's Maxwell Briscoe catalog from 1906, Tarrytown, New York, Maxwell Briscoe Motor Company. Officers and directors, Ben Briscoe, president, J.D. Maxwell, vice president and general superintendent. And main factory here in Tarrytown on the river, offices, and then they had some other branch factories around as well. And so this comment here says, after 14 years of hard work, determination, and steadfast purpose, Mr. J.D. Maxwell, its designer and namesake, is able to say, I have succeeded in putting on the market the greatest automobile value ever offered. And so here is the Touring Model H. One thing that Maxwell had, I don't know if you can see right here on the radiator, which is brass. We've got some later pictures that are in color. It had this bar across about halfway up that was brass, and that was kind of Maxwell's trademark grill, kind of before trademark grills were a thing. And so this is the touring car, limousine, runabout, the doctor's car, and then a delivery wagon, and then the gentleman's speedster. So Maxwell's selling cars, and this guy with this horrible name, Cadwallader Washburn Kelsey, he was from Philadelphia area, and he had dabbled in automotive stuff. He was a young guy, great at sales, and he reached out to Briscoe, Ben Briscoe, saying, I'd really like the rights to sell your Maxwell car in Philadelphia. And he's a shameless promoter. He knows how to promote things, knows how to get publicity, and he had a thing for taking things up steps in Philadelphia. Now, when you think of steps in Philadelphia, you probably think of the Philadelphia Museum of Art and this. Maybe. So, 70 years before Sylvester Stallone ran up those steps, Kelsey drove a Maxwell up the steps of the Mercantile Building and collected a $1,500 bet. Somebody said, you can't do that. You're not going to be allowed to. He did it anyway. Police weren't thrilled. He got publicity. Then he gets the idea, so silent films were kind of becoming a thing, and he says, I want to get this on film. And so he takes 3 Maxwells and goes to the park, Fairmount Park in Philadelphia, where there's these big, long steps into the park. And so has a film crew. He alerts the press. 2 of the Maxwell cars, he had 3, 2 of them go act as decoys for the police. They deter the police away from this. And then he runs the 3rd one up this long run of steps in Fairmount Park and gets it on film. And then it's in the papers and the whole thing. So, I mean, he is, like I said, a shameless promoter and knows how to get publicity. And so, a few days after that driving stunt, then he announces the greatest 1,000-mile endurance run ever made. And it takes place throughout all over Philadelphia. And he has this endurance run for 1,000 miles going through Philadelphia. So, by the fall of 1905, Ben Briscoe, who's running, Maxwell Briscoe, notices sales in Philadelphia area are pretty decent, and this guy knows what he's doing, and he asks Kelsey, says, would you come and be my sales director for the entire company? Kelsey's only 25 years old at this point, and he says, sure. He accepts. And so here's a photo of him in a stripped-down Maxwell runabout. So the Maxwell was kind of a everyday car, lower priced. Their slogan here, perfectly simple, simply perfect. They used a drive shaft instead of chain drive, which was kind of a new thing. A lot of cars up to that point had used chain drive. They were using a drive shaft. But they had numerous wins in a lot of races. They had the Glidden Tour. Maxwell won a perfect score, no repairs needed. They won Climb to the Clouds. They won the Deming Trophy on the Glidden Tour in 1906. They traveled New York to Boston in 1907, even though they ran on alcohol rather than gasoline. And, oops, clicked too far. By 1906, they are 5th in sales in the nation. So we had Ford, Cadillac, Rambler, Rio, and Maxwell producing over 2,000 cars, which doesn't seem like a lot, but this is early days of auto manufacturing. And so sales are growing, and so they're out of capacity. They need more space. And so in 1907, they built a new factory in Newcastle, Indiana, to build 4-cylinder cars. Up to this point, Maxwells were 2-cylinder, horizontally opposed, water-cooled, horizontally opposed. That was, the small little runabout, but they feel like 4 cylinders are going to be the future. And so they opened this new factory in Newcastle. All right, so Briscoes. So Ben Briscoe is running Maxwell Briscoe. His brother Frank, and they still have the manufacturing sheet metal shop, his brother Frank says, hey, you guys are having success with making cars, maybe I should do that. And so Frank teams up with Alonzo Brush and invests in the Brush automobile and sets up a factory to make the Brush. We'll come back to that, why that is important. Okay, Ben Briscoe, he's an entrepreneur at heart. And he feels that the auto industry is gaining momentum, but we need some economies of scale in manufacturing. Him and Billy Durant get along very well, okay? Billy Durant, if you know, had bought Buick from the Flint Wagon Works and had started up, well, eventually will start up General Motors. But Ben Briscoe talks to Durant, Ford, and Ransom Olds of Rio and says, what if we consolidate into one big company? And Durant loves the idea. Ford and Olds are a little skeptical. Briscoe and Durant want to do a stock swap. They say, let's just swap, let's just issue shares. It'll just be a stock swap, no cash exchanged, and we'll operate as one company. Henry Ford doesn't like that idea, says I would rather have cash. I don't want to work with a bunch of lawyers and New York bankers. I want cash or no deal. And this is way before the Model T. So Ford kind of balks at the idea. Olds also then kind of parrots what Ford says and says, yeah, you're right, we need cash. The deal falls apart. What's interesting is Billy Durant sets up a shell company called International Motors, which he later changes the name to General Motors in anticipation of this deal, which the deal falls through. 1908, Maxwell bumps up to 4th place. Cadillac has fallen off the top 5. Studebaker's bumped up. It's still kind of Ford and Buick at the top 2, but Maxwell's making some real headway here. And so racing is a thing. Early cars, a lot of racing, trying to prove how durable they are and those kind of things. And so there's this race called the Vanderbilt Cup, which was kind of probably the equivalent of the Le Mans race today, where it's long endurance race, high speed, and it was held 1904 to 1916. And Briscoe, Kelsey, and Maxwell put together this crazy car. They take 6 of the 2-cylinder motors and create a flat 12-cylinder, and they're going to try and race at the Vanderbilt Cup. They don't get it done in time, but they do take it to Ventnor Beach, and it comes close to breaking the record for the 1-mile time. So the Glidden Tour was another popular tour race that was held every year by the AAA. And 1905 to 1913, Maxwell did really well in a lot of those early Glidden tours. This is some footage from an early Glidden tour. Yeah, a lot of old cars, and I couldn't tell you what they all were there, but Charles Price drove a Maxwell 4,700 miles with the hood wired shut. No maintenance needed, no issues, and that was actually done as a pilot for the Glidden tour. So, I mean, 4,700 miles in one of those early vehicles is pretty impressive. You know, so Maxwell's got a good reputation for durability, for reliability, and which is one reason they're gaining sales. So back to our sales guy, Kelsey. So he's willing to do anything for sales, right? He wants publicity, he does lots of things, and he says, hey, women read magazines, women want adventure, women are starting to buy cars, let's kind of capitalize on this. And by the way, Ladies' Home Journal, this is an interesting fact that I found in doing this, researching this, was the first magazine to ever reach 1 million subscribers. 1903 was a woman's magazine. So Kelsey sponsors, and she was kind of a famous woman race car driver at the time, Joan Cuneo, and she took first place, the 1 mile run in Atlantic City. And so he's got a woman driver doing a race. And then he bumps into this gal named Alice Ramsey. And she was an experienced driver and mechanic. Her husband had bought her a 1908 little Maxwell runabout, and she'd already done tour endurance runs with it. And he actually sees her at one of these other events and notices her driving skills. And he says, hey, what if I get you to drive cross country from New York to San Francisco? I'll get company Maxwell, we'll pay all expenses, we'll furnish you for the brand new Maxwell DA. Alice says, sure, why not? And so she decides to take this on and drive cross country. So she becomes the first woman to drive across the USA. We have a little display and video out here next to this Maxwell, kind of talking about her journey on that. So it was the thing to follow in 1909. And this, I believe, is part of the entourage of her tour, stopping at the Maxwell Briscoe offices in Chicago. It did take 3 weeks longer than anticipated. Lots of issues. There were not a lot of roads. Pretty primitive conditions in going cross country. Her and 3 companions, they left on June 9th. They arrived in San Francisco 53 days later to crowds outside the St. James Hotel in San Francisco. 3,800 miles, 59 days. The Maxwell she drove suffered no more than 3 broken axles, no more than 3. Kelsey awards her with a brand new Maxwell for her efforts. So she gets a brand new car out of the deal, and famous. So, oh, here, again, so right here, this is Maxwell's trademark look with the brass band across the center of the grille at that point. 1909, Maxwell is up to 3rd place, okay? Ford, Buick, Maxwell, and Studebaker EMF is in 4th. So 9,400 cars, 3rd place. Okay, Ben Briscoe, corporately. His chat with Durant several years ago. He still is convinced we need economies of scale. So he gets some investors, a group of friends, business associates, and he creates his own merger of all these companies. And he pulls Maxwell Briscoe into it, his brother's Brush company, who his brother had started Brush, Columbia, which Columbia Motor Car Company was actually the company that held the Selden patent. If you, some of you may know, the Selden patent was a patent on who could make a car. The Selden patent said this is the right to make a car, and you either have to pay royalties or not make a car. Courier Car Company, Stoddard Dayton in Dayton, Ohio, Sampson, the Briscoe Manufacturing, Sheet Metal Works, and about 130 other smaller supply companies. So he creates this early corporate giant auto company. And so it was a big deal. This is news from Motor Age publication of 1910. Talks about, incorporation, 16 million holding organization, Maxwell Briscoe's kind of the leader of it. This is an interesting comment here. Let me read this. The character of the men in the company is represented in this new lineup is such as to whet the imagination. It is anticipated by the knowing ones in the inner circle that the United States Motor Company is destined to rival the Napoleonic movements of the most ambitious efforts in recent times. It being the idea, according to reports, to coalesce a series of companies, each one of which is to be a leader in the particular line of endeavor, financially self-sustaining, and so situated with respect to the market that the united concerns will add their respective quota without overlapping. So they covered the market from low price to high price. I mean, they were kind of pioneers of this in a way. More news about it. Columbia Motor joins Maxwell Briscoe. And so USMC comes into existence in 1910. Ben Briscoe is president chairman. Maxwell becomes head of the Maxwell Briscoe division, and our sales guy leaves. And this is a quote from Kelsey. He says, when the USMC was suggested by Mr. Briscoe, both J.D. Maxwell and myself were very much opposed to it. Mr. Maxwell, however, went along as a good cooperator. I behaved like a spoiled boy. And he leaves. Briscoe does talk him into coming back and heading up sales for Columbia division. Very short line, doesn't last. He's like not working in this giant conglomerate. So we lost our sales guy, which is important in business, okay? Brush, so Frank Briscoe, Ben's brother, had started Brush. What they bring to the table is a plant and 60 acres of land in Highland Park, which is just on the north side of Detroit, okay? Some of you automotive people know what significance Highland Park has. That's Ford's early plant was at Highland Park, and there's a lot of other automotive stuff happening there in Highland Park. This is a very oversimplified merger tree of what USMC was made of. So you have Stoddard Dayton, we have Sampson, this is all Riker, Electric, Columbia deal. We've got Brush and Maxwell Briscoe, and then the Briscoe manufacturing that the Briscoe brothers had together, and it all comes together under USMC. 1910, Maxwell sales exceed expectations and need more capacity. So they build another new plant on the Brush property there in Highland Park. 1910 models, I pulled this is just an interesting little overview of the powertrain for the Maxwell. So over here on the left is kind of a bird's eye view of the two-cylinder, horizontally opposed motor that the little runabout used. And here's the four-cylinder that the four-cylinders used. And what's interesting is you look at this cross-section, it's got a T-shaped combustion chamber, with an intake valve and exhaust valve on each side, and it looks like it's running two separate camshafts, one for each row of valve train. So kind of an interesting design for that. 1910, there was a recession. Sales are on a downturn by the end of 1910. So we just had, we exceeded sales beyond expectations, and now they tank. The primary driver of this recession was Congress enforced the Sherman Antitrust Act, which had been passed years earlier. And they broke up Standard Oil and American Tobacco. And then by October, Briscoe reads in the news that Durant just got booted out of General Motors because he overextended in trying to acquire too many companies. And so Durant's out from GM. The downturn in sales wasn't a bad thing necessarily. Maybe we could have survived that, but Briscoe learns that the divisions were stocking up on supplies in anticipation of the recession being over and things are going to pick back up. And all of those inventories were non-returnable, were cash flow crunch. And so Briscoe recommends a drastic 1/3 to 1/2 cut in workers' wages. That's a huge chunk. And so this little chart here, this is interesting to look at. So this is the length of U.S. recessions from 110 years. And right here is the 1910 one, and it lasts 24 months, and then boom, we hit one in 1913 right after that. And they're pretty significant. This is the what we call the Great Depression here, this one, but those are pretty significant in itself. So January 1911, Briscoe announced sweeping reduction in prices. I mean, he had slashed prices and doesn't really help sales at all. So the executive committee authorizes sale of $12.5 million in bonds. They only sell about half of them. They get bought by this investment banker, Eugene Meyer, who later becomes chairman of the Fed Reserve in the 1930s. But so he controls about $6 million of bonds in Maxwell. 1912, we're still selling cars, making cars. Maxwell, to this point, had used letters for series names. 1912, they changed to model names, and so the two-cylinder AA becomes the Messenger, and all the other four cylinders, Q, I, E, and G, get renamed to the Mascot, Mercury, and Special. And they drop the trademark brass band radiator grill and will go to a kind of a, I think they call it Columbia-style radiator, which is kind of a peaked point. And so we have out here a 1912 Maxwell Special, which was the top-of-the-line Maxwell for 1912. All specials were painted royal green with Wedgwood green wheels, which ours is out here, and all the specials were that exact same color. And so here's a photo of the one we have right outside the door here with that. Late 1911, so they typically announce their models late summer, early fall for 1912. October 1911 brings another win to the Glidden Tour, New York City to Jacksonville. They had 3 factory cars and 2 independents, and the factory team wins without a single penalty. And here's a photo from that event that they won in the 1911 Glidden Tour. Spring of 1912, $6 million wasn't enough to pay all the bills. Brother Frank Briscoe leaves saying, I got mental and physical issues. I can't deal with this. I'm taking a leave, and resigns. Ben Briscoe asked the board for a 90-day extension to pay bills. It's accepted, but only if W. Strong of the Bankers Trust has direct charge over finances. So Strong's elected chairman above Ben Briscoe. 70% of sales of USMC coming from Maxwell Briscoe and then the Briscoe brothers manufacturing. So all of those other companies that they had acquired were not really financially stable. And in fact, Ben Briscoe, being a kind of that entrepreneur mentality, doesn't always look at details. Stoddard Dayton actually had owed $6 million in payables to suppliers that somehow they overlooked. $6 million in payables, and like, well, okay, oops. All right. September 1912, Maxwell scraps the model names after 1 year and goes to a numbered naming system, and they discontinue the two-cylinder Maxwell. People are wanting faster cars, more comfortable cars. The old two cylinders kind of not a thing anymore, and so they launch 3 different 4 cylinders, the 22, the 30, the 40, and they launch a new 6-cylinder Model 50. This here is a photo of the Model 40, which looks pretty similar to the Maxwell Special we've got sitting out here in 1912. A few days later, after they announced their 1913 models, there's a consortium of suppliers that say, we haven't got our money. We want paid. And they file a petition at the Southern District in New York City Court saying, you need to appoint some receivers and get us our money. And they do make the request that you keep the company together and don't liquidate it, otherwise we probably never will get our money. And the judge grants a petition. Okay. So Ben Briscoe departs by November 1912. Says, okay, yeah, he's out of there. And the reorganization committee will purchase the assets, reorganize, and they have someone willing to head up the company. We've got somebody that we're going to put in charge, a little different view on things. And Flanders is going to come and head up the company. Oh, not that Flanders, this Flanders. Walter Flanders. So who's Walter Flanders? He is originally from the company EMF, which stood for Everett, Metzger, and Flanders. And I think we had an EMF here on display a couple years ago on loan. They did really well early on. The jokes were, though, EMF stood for Every Morning Fix It, kind of like you hear the Ford acronyms today. But they did successful. They partnered with Studebaker to sell through Studebaker channels, and Studebaker ended up buying them out for a significant amount of money. And what I've heard is that it took Studebaker into the 1920s to finally pay off the loans from when they bought EMF. So this is late, probably 08, 09, 10 when they sold out to Studebaker. And so Flanders and Everett and Metzger, after they sell EMF to Studebaker, they start up another auto venture. And it's the Everett company, and they make a car called the Flanders, and he's teamed up with Everett and Metzger again. He was a production guy, unlike Ben Briscoe, who was, entrepreneur, finance guy. Flanders is a production guy, 6'3", 250 pounds, did not have a high school education. His early days were working for Ford, and he was instrumental in setting up early production line stuff, getting some efficiencies on the shop floor at Ford before he and Everett and Metzger started EMF. His philosophy on production was, and we would probably call it lean manufacturing today. You figure out what your sales are going to be, you match your production to that, you match buying your raw materials to what production is, and you have an even flow, and then once you set that, you tell the salespeople you have to sell, here's what we've planned, and you don't have stockpiles of inventory. And so probably way ahead of his time in that thinking. So we've got a production guy in charge now. So the reorganization committee says we need to rebrand this company. Let's call it the Standard Motor Company. And they will also acquire Flanders Company so they can get him as, president of the company. So they acquire the assets of Flanders. Jonathan Maxwell leaves at this point. I think he was not a fan of Briscoe's USMC corporate plan, and now we've got somebody new in charge again, and Jonathan Maxwell departs. So the committee, when they go to file for setting up Standard Motor, they realize, well, we can't use that in some states. Standard company's already taken, so the decision's made, let's just go with Maxwell. That's the division that has the most, popularity, is the most recognizable, and has the most equity. So they essentially renamed the entire company the Maxwell Company. And Flanders makes a lot of changes. He says headquarters are not going to be in New York City. We're going to move to Detroit in Highland Park. And he tours all the factories of all these different divisions, and he says practically none of these products we have are sellable. They're not competitive at all. We need to get with the game. And over the next year, year and a half, Brush, Stoddard Dayton, Columbia, Sampson are all discontinued. And they really kind of stick with just the Maxwell brand. They consolidate production in Detroit, Dayton, and Newcastle, Indiana. They either sell off or close the other plants. The original Tarrytown, New York plant, they sell to Billy Durant. And his new company, after he got booted out of General Motors, he's starting up a new company called Chevrolet. And so they sell Tarrytown, New York to Billy Durant. So none of the models, Flanders doesn't like any of the vehicle productions, none of the models, and he says, we need something competitive. And so they quickly rebadge or rename the Flanders vehicles he was selling through the Flanders Company into Maxwell's, and he knows that's a short-term solution. But Maxwell USMC had been working on a new four-cylinder car. So that's really kind of sped up and green-lighted into, let's get this into production. And that gets launched by that summer as the new Maxwell 25. and they will build it in Detroit there at the Highland Park plant as a low-priced four-cylinder. So this is an ad from that time frame. The top one, the Maxwell 50, is a six-cylinder, and it's really a rebadged Flanders car. And then the middle one is a four-cylinder, again, a rebadged Flanders. And then the bottom one is the new Maxwell 25. And over on the right, this is essentially an ad to try and allay customers' fears of financial issues, and talks about how we are stable. We have kind of, got things under control financially, and we're a solid, stable company now. So they're running ads to essentially assure the public that we're a going concern going forward. Here's an ad, more automobile than you ever hoped for, the Maxwell 25, $695. And so by 1915, Maxwell's pretty much got bad publicity behind them, and sales more than doubled to 44,000, and they're in fourth place. Buick's actually fallen quite a bit. Willys Overland is really ramped up, and the Dodge Brothers, a new entry. Dodge Brothers used to be a big supplier to Ford when they decided, hey, we can make our own car. And so they surge ahead as a brand new entity. But Maxwell's still in fourth place. I mean, Maxwell was, a respected name for quite a while. 1915, the big news in 1915. So we've got a lot of women's rights going on, and they want the right to vote. And so the largest ever suffrage parade was held in New York City, over 3 miles of marchers championing for women's right to vote. And so Maxwell, in response to the era of the times, they set up a women's sales office that we're going to have women salesmen. And this was kind of, they were at the forefront, cutting edge of women's rights. You look at what Kelsey did with Maxwell, and sponsoring women race drivers and getting Alice Ramsey to drive cross country. Maxwell was very progressive for that time. And so this is the women's sales office in New York City, and they felt like women can sell cars as well as guys. Another ad, they've dropped the price, kind of like Ford was doing. And Flanders was a believer in that philosophy too. If we continue to do production and focus on just one model, the other rebadged Flanders cars have been dropped by this point. They actually sold off that Flanders plant, and they're really focusing on just one specific model, with a few body variations, much like Ford did. Continue to get economies of scale and continue to refine it. But what Maxwell did in competition with Ford is Maxwell always advertised that it was a complete car. Unlike a Ford that you had to add all these accessories, Maxwell came standard with electric lights. Electric lights, self-starter were all standard. They were the first with an adjustable front seat. Interesting fact there. Like I said, Flanders' belief that we can get more quality, reliability, and lower costs going forward doing that. The Wonder Car, all low first cost, records broken. And they talk a lot about maintenance too, that not only is it low cost to buy, it's low cost to maintain. An endurance record, this is an interesting record, and you think this would be phenomenal today even, I think. They had a stock Maxwell 25 that did a nonstop trip of 22,000 miles without ever shutting the engine off. And this is kind of phenomenal for 1916, 17. So they started in November, and they didn't shut the car off until January 1917. They averaged 500 miles a day, new world record for miles gained without ever turning the car off for over 2 months. Well, I guess a month and a half. So at the end of 1917, Maxwell has sales of 75,000, the best year ever. And Flanders saw no reason that's not going to continue, and has confidence that Maxwell needs more capacity. So earlier on, he sold off a lot of those plants. Now we're at the point where we need some more capacity. And in hindsight, too, the plants he sold off were outdated, is also what he said. You know, what they kept were the newest, the Newcastle, Indiana, the new one at Highland Park, and so they need more capacity. And so this company called Chalmers, and this is a whole other story you could make on Chalmers. They're a Detroit auto manufacturer with a new plant on Jefferson Avenue. It was designed by Albert Kahn, one of the earliest concrete reinforced plants, and they are over capacity. They have too much capacity. And so Flanders strikes a deal with Chalmers, and this is probably one of the weirdest deals ever. Flanders says, okay, we will lease your plant for 5 years. We will run it. We will still make your Chalmers cars as well, and we will split profits. And then at the end of 5 years, if we don't renew, the plant goes back to Chalmers. And so you're essentially renting factory space and running it. The stockholders approved the deal. And then at the end of 1917, Flanders had had a 5-year contract to be president. His 5 years are up. He feels like Maxwell's in a pretty stable place at this point. He assumes the role of just chairman, and he's not involved day to day. And he's become a millionaire at age 46, and so he semi-retires to be a gentleman farmer. Mitchell succeeds Flanders as president. And so here's a Chalmers from that era. Chalmers was a larger car, 6 cylinders mostly, whereas Maxwell was the 4-cylinder Model 25. Chalmers was a little larger car at the upper end of the market. End of World War I. So auto production was curtailed during the war, and 1918 volumes could not exceed whatever you made in 1917. You could only make 50% of that. But by the time the World War I was over, production gets cleared by 1919 and full production resumes. And then Flanders says, I'm going to step down as chairman as well by 1919. So after the war, President Wilson removed all the price controls. So we had price controls going on for prices during World War I, so we don't have inflation. We had profit restraints even, so companies could not make a certain amount of profit. They had to curtail the amount of profit they made. Once those go off, what do you think happens, right? Companies say, hey, now we can make profits, and the price controls are off. So companies say, hey, we can raise prices now. By 1920, consumer price index was 105% on top of what it was in 1916. Labor movement was gaining momentum, a lot of push towards union membership, a lot of strikes, a lot of riots, inflation, end of 1919, early 1920. Maxwell made a lot of changes to their car, over 70 changes, but they had to increase the price from $895 to $1055 due to inflationary issues. And then the Federal Reserve, which this would probably be equivalent today to raising interest rates to curb inflation, what they said was, we're going to make the mandatory down payment on vehicles 50% of the price of the car instead of 25%. So, Federal Reserve policy that, okay, we need to cut inflation, so let's make it less easy to borrow money, but what does that do to the auto industry? You essentially force auto production to a standstill. And Maxwell's not alone in this. So, the same chart we looked at earlier, right? Here was 1910 recession. Here's the early 1921, the biggest blip since the 1910 one. And so sales are at a standstill. Ford actually shut his plant down, I think, for like 2 or 3 months, sent everybody home. The company decides, and I don't know why they thought at this point, that lease they had with Chalmers, they said, we really just need to merge these two companies and combine them instead of just leasing this factory. In hindsight, there's a lot of discussion on why did they do that. But Maxwell makes a push to put out their 1920 models to dealers, essentially forcing dealers to take cars. You know, production's a standstill, sales are stagnant, and they push stuff onto dealers. Dealers can't sell them, so what dealers do is they refuse to accept deliveries, and they all sit on the railroad yards and on railroad sidings, just sitting there all across the country. And there's estimates of about possibly 26,000 vehicles scattered all over the country that are unsold. There are also reports that axles are breaking on Maxwells, and fuel tank hold-down straps are coming loose when you drive on a rough road. And they're not having good luck with this merger with Chalmers. And so a banking consortium's formed. Here we go again, right? Another banking crisis at corporate. And they advance $3 to $4 million until they can resolve this merger with Chalmers. And James Brady is one of the most powerful directors on the board. And he goes back to Ben Briscoe. He was on the board back then even. And he asks a well-known Kansas auto expert to chair up the committee, a guy named Walter Chrysler. And Chrysler, some of you know, was born in Wamego, Kansas, grew up in Ellis. He had worked for Buick, for Durant. And then Durant got ousted, and then Durant came back. Chrysler and Durant did not see eye to eye, get along, and Chrysler cashes out, resigns from Buick. This is probably late teens. Quits Buick, cashes out his Buick GM stock to the tune of $10 million. And so Chrysler retires. I mean, he's young, he retires. But but he's known as, you know, a production guy and knows how to turn businesses around. And he was currently doing a turnaround at Willys Overland. This banking consortium that actually was in charge of Maxwell's finances was also in charge of Willys. And the banking group had hired Chrysler to do a turnaround at Willys. And Chrysler had actually asked for $1 million salary at Willys, which they accepted, interestingly enough, which was unheard of at that day. That same banking group, like I said, is in charge at Maxwell, and they say, hey, do you want to turn around another company? And Chrysler agrees. He doesn't ask for $1 million from them. It's much more manageable salary. And so they recommend Chrysler to help turn around Maxwell Chalmers. Chrysler has Maxwell recall all those unsold cars. Let's fix the rear axles. Let's put additional gas tank straps on, and then we ship them back to the dealers and tell the dealers, sell them for whatever you can. The committee is shocked to learn that they're only making about $5 a car on that. And Chrysler's response was, you hired me to get rid of 26,000 cars? I did just that. There you go, right? Problem solved. So Maxwell's had some bad publicity again now, and so they come up with a new ad campaign called The Good Maxwell. Several mechanical changes, an increase in horsepower. Chrysler later said in interviews, he said he hated this ad campaign, The Good Maxwell. It implies that the earlier ones weren't good, which they kind of weren't there for a while, but that's the new slogan going forward, The Good Maxwell. The Good Maxwell, and a new company logo there too. The Good Maxwell touring car. So they did some mechanical updates the previous year in 21, you know, fixed the gas tank straps, did the rear axle, and then in 22 they kind of did some changes to make the car look better. And you could also get the steel, full steel artillery wheels instead of the wood if you wanted. And then here's the 22 Chalmers. They also use steel disc wheels. And then sales are up, more than tripled from 21. Maxwell brings in $2 million in profit. Chalmers has over $1 million loss, okay? And so total combined profit's only $800,000 for the two entities. So Chrysler's been working kind of unofficially for the company. no contract, just kind of a handshake deal saying, okay, I'll make some changes and run it. The board finally says, we need to make this official, and are you going to run this? Are you not? Are you just an advisor? What's the plan? And so after a lot of negotiations, Chrysler agrees on a 4-year contract, puts him in control of the entire company, normal salary, stock options, the regular stuff that comes with that. And here's a couple interesting things. Chrysler also gives Maxwell Company the right to use his name on any cars if they want. Chrysler's kind of a famous guy at this point, and his name has some value. Maxwell also agrees to pay Chrysler $100,000 for this car he's been working on. And what this car is, when Chrysler was at Willys, he had hired this engineering firm, Zeter, Skelton, and Breer, to design a car for him that was going to be launched under the Willys banner, but it would be branded a Chrysler. Well, Willys sold that New Jersey plant that Chrysler was helping to turn around, and with it went the design for that car. So he has the engineering firm work on a second car, which he calls the Model B. And this is the one that Maxwell essentially pays $100,000 for, that Chrysler had kind of funded on his own. Maxwell says, we'll pay you $100,000 for the rights to that car. And there's the engineering firm of Zeter, Skelton, and Breer. 1923, they put 4-wheel hydraulic brakes on the Chalmers, which is a big deal. The Maxwell 25 is mostly unchanged, but the big news is they launch this new Chrysler that he had the engineering team working on, and it's called the B70. Why it's called the B is that first one he had them work on was the Model A. This one's the B70 because it has 70 horsepower and will go 70 miles an hour. And so here's Walter Chrysler and Fred Zeter and the new Chrysler 70. It was revolutionary for its day. The first high compression engine will do 70 miles, outperforming Buick and other competitors. 4-wheel hydraulic brakes, 7-main bearing crankshaft, full pressure lubrication, replaceable oil filter, standard air cleaner. It's a sensation. The public says, wow, this is kind of the car of the future. And a lot of publicity. Public interest is phenomenal. They set up production at the Chalmers factory, and sales are great on this, so much so that they make the decision to drop the Chalmers car and the Chalmers brand to make room for Chrysler production. Interestingly enough, Hugh Chalmers is still on the board of directors for some time after this. Okay, so we've got the Chrysler being produced at the Chalmers plant, and we've also got the Maxwell 25 in 1925, and production exceeds 100,000 that year at Chrysler and Maxwell combined, yearly record in Maxwell's history. And the good Maxwell, the Model 25C, gets a completely new 4-cylinder engine. Chrysler has his engineering team come up with a completely new engine for the Maxwell. They add a C to it. And my guess is that since the Chrysler Model B, this is Model C. That's my guess why it is, or it could stand for Chrysler, I'm not sure. But the Model 25C, good Maxwell for 1925. The board sees the success that this Chrysler car has had, and Chrysler in running this has done a big turnaround, and there's a lot of chatter of, why don't we just call this the Chrysler Corporation? And after deliberation, it's unanimously approved. And so Maxwell Motor becomes officially Chrysler Corporation. And 1 year after that, the Maxwell 25C is rebranded as the 4-cylinder Chrysler F58 model. It receives a new radiator to match the bigger Chrysler 70, but it's a Maxwell. Okay. That continues through 1928, Chrysler's 50 Series 4, which is rebranded Maxwell. And then in the summer of 28, the Chrysler 50 4-cylinder is replaced by a slightly improved version called the Plymouth Model Q to go head-to-head with Ford's Model A. So it's really a Maxwell, revised and changed. Okay? So that's the end of the Maxwell brand, so to speak. It just has evolved over time into the Chrysler Corporation. And so the heritage, so what happened to all of what they had way back when? So the people, just a quick little overview. Jonathan Maxwell, when he left after Flanders took over, he spent his later years raising purebred cattle in Maryland. Not really automotive related at all. Ben Briscoe, interesting enough, a few months after he leaves, after USMC gets reorganized, him and his brother Frank get together and decide to build another car, and it's actually in France. They go to France and they build a car called the Ajax, and then a year later they launch that same car essentially in the US as the Briscoe. And it lasts for several years and then folds. He actually joined up in World War I, was a lieutenant commander, received the Navy Cross, and then after the war he developed a process for refining crude oil and had a company called Frontenac Oil in Canada, which was later bought by one of the big oil companies here in the US. And then he retired to Florida experimenting in growing tongue trees. I'm not sure what a tongue tree is, but that was his later years. Cadwallader Washburn Kelsey, our sales guy, he actually dabbled in starting his own car company with a friction drive thing. It was not successful at all. But later he became a distributor for the Siemens rotary tilling machine of Switzerland. He made a lot of improvements and set up a company called Rototiller, which we've all heard of. He retired as president of Rototiller in 1960. Alice Ramsey, what happened to her? Between 1909 and 1975, she drove across the country more than 30 times. She was named Woman Motorist of the Century by AAA in 1960 and was the first woman inducted into the Automotive Hall of Fame. Walter Flanders spent time on his 1,200-acre estate outside Pontiac, Michigan, raised livestock, poultry, purchased plantations in Virginia, owned a chain of grocery stores, apartment buildings. But in 1923, while he was giving some guests a drive around his estate, he lost control of his car, suffered injuries, and he died from complications of those injuries. The facilities, Tarrytown, New York, the original Maxwell factory. Sold to Chevrolet. It operated as a plant until 1996. The last products from there were GM's plastic minivans, Lumina APV, Transport, Old Silhouette. It held the record at that time of the longest running plant in GM history, originally Maxwell's first plant. Newcastle, Indiana, that Maxwell built to build the four-cylinder cars. Flanders turned it into a forge and parts plant, making parts. It continued making parts until 2002, when Daimler Chrysler made a joint venture with Metaldyne. Metaldyne closed it in 2009, and it's been demolished. Jefferson Avenue, the Chalmers plant. The last products were the Dodge Aries and the Maxwell Reliant, or Plymouth Reliant, sorry. It was torn down in about 1990, 1991, and they built a new plant across the street, which is called Jefferson North, to build the Grand Cherokee. And Highland Park, what Brush brought to the table. 60 acres of land where they built a Maxwell plant. That was Chrysler headquarters until the early 90s, until they moved into a new tech center in Auburn Hills, north of Detroit. And so the thing is, there's a lot of Maxwell still there. I mean, and it's almost like the ghost of Maxwell haunts Chrysler, I think, sometimes. You see all these financial crises. Yeah, they were great in sales, but corporately, we need somebody to come save us, whether it's Flanders or Chrysler or Iacocca, or the list goes on, right? Nothing has changed in a way. So, with that, any questions? Yes.
Probably everybody knows this. Didn't Chalmers make tractors?
So that's a whole different company. Yes. Yeah, the story on Chalmers is Chalmers had a company called, I want to say, Detroit Motors or Thomas Detroit, and he had a couple engineers working for him, Chapin and Coffin, and they left his company and said, we're going to go start our own company, and they got funding from the guy who ran the big department store in Detroit, Hudson. So they started Hudson, and then Chalmers kept his company and renamed it after himself, Chalmers, and then, yeah, and then teamed up with Maxwell. Yes?
Regarding that car that drove 22,000 miles, back then the oil was not the best. So how did they replace the oil?
I don't have an answer for that. Yeah, you would think, unless you just keep adding oil and hopefully, yeah, keep it going. Yeah. All right. Hey, one.
Do you give this or a similar presentation to your students in the college?
No, I don't. Haven't given this to students. Maybe I should, about business dealings. Okay.